This video is for if you want to do an EGR block off in a smart Fortwo CDI diesel. You'll see right here is your EGR valve. Apologize for the light, it seems like I'm always doing these videos at nighttime. Right here is your EGR valve. On the top is your EGR solenoid. If you remove the solenoid, you'll see a little valve that depresses in there. And it's that valve that sticks. So if you don't have a light on your dash, if you don't have an EGR fault, then you don't have to remove the EGR valve if you don't want to. It's a good idea to clean it and then put it back in. I made a video on how to do that. But this is a quicker version, an easy way to do an EGR block off. So here's your EGR valve right here. There's the EGR cooler tube that comes straight from your turbo and supplies exhaust into your EGR valve. That's this pipe right here. See, there's the two bolts there that run into your EGR valve. See, this pipe here runs into the flange with the two bolts, and that runs into your EGR valve. And what that valve does is open and close and allow a little bit of exhaust into the intake. But the problem with that exhaust is it also carries carbon, and it wears out your intake valves and shortens the life of the engine. You can see the pipe coming up from the back of the manifold there. This is part of it here. This is the cooling line going into the pipe. That keeps it cool before it goes into the EGR valve, because the exhaust coming out of the engine is pretty hot. So it cools it off in that pipe before it enters the EGR valve. So that pipe, there is coolant running through it. And it's a good time to check your exhaust manifold for leaks if you have a crack in the exhaust manifold. Since you got your muffler off already, you don't have to pull your muffler off, but if you have it off, just to make it a little bit easier, it's a good time to check it for cracks. Because once you get a crack there, when the manifold gets hot, the crack opens up, and then you lose exhaust pressure, and in turn you lose boost pressure. So when I did the EGR block off in the other car, I had to remove the EGR valve to clean it because it was sticking and I kept getting a light. And I made my own plate. I just held up some cardboard to the EGR valve and made my template, and then cut it out of some 18 gauge steel, drilled 2 holes in it, checked, made sure it worked, and then installed it in the car. So in that case, I had to remove the EGR valve anyway, and I wasn't thinking about it in terms of just installing the plate without removing the EGR valve. But on eBay, I was taking a look, and they sell these block-out plates that just slide right in place. So all you got to do is loosen those 2 bolts off and pry the pipe out far enough you can slide this block-out plate in there. And it's a 18 gauge steel plate as well, so they're the same thickness. What I found when I tried to install this plate when I was reassembling everything is when you pull the EGR pipe or the tube off there that feeds the exhaust to the EGR, the pipe doesn't want to move that far. It's, you know, it's pretty solid, so you have to put a fair bit of pressure on it to separate enough to get this plate in there. And then you got to slide it down just far enough to line up that hole, and then push it back up to line up the hole so you can get the bolt through it. And it was a bit of a pain in the butt. But with this other one here, where it just has the slots on the bottom, you can just slide it right in. That should be a whole heck of a lot better. I didn't know why I just didn't think to take the grinder and make 2 slots on the bottom there, and then I could just slide that plate in. You live and you learn. So now I got this new one here that should slide in pretty easily. So I'm gonna take those bolts off and put something in there to pry that back, and then slide this plate in. You want your gasket on the exhaust side of it, and then you can always put silicone on the intake side of it, or vice versa. It's up to you. I figure an exhaust leak is more prevalent than an intake manifold leak, and I know that if you put silicone on the intake side and then seal it up, it's going to stay sealed. Whereas on the exhaust side of it, it might see a little bit of extra heat, and it might burn out the silicone over time, and then you get a leak on the exhaust side. So that's why I say put the gasket on the exhaust side, but that's up to you. You can put a gasket on either side. The plate didn't come with a gasket, so there's only one gasket in there. Actually, this one might not even have a gasket, or it might be there. It might be there. If it doesn't have a gasket, then I'm just going to use some high temp silicone on the exhaust side and then squish it back together. The easiest way to access your EGR tube is to take your rear cowling off the car and then use two long extensions to get that top bolt, and then just a single and a short extension to get the bottom bolt. It's easier to get it in there if you're holding the ratchet. I'm holding the camera at the same time, so it's a little bit more difficult. You can always take your intake tube off as well and make it a little bit easier. Yeah, that's probably the easiest thing to do. And then it's a good opportunity to inspect that and make sure there's no cracks in it. And to remove your intake tube, you just remove the crankcase vent on the top just by pulling it out. And then there's a hose clamp on the turbo side, and then there's a hose clamp on the airbox side. And you just loosen those off, and you should be able to pull your intake tube right out. Top hose clamp is pretty rusted out. So if you want to reuse the hose clamp, spray some penetrating oil on there. And there's the intake tube. You want to make sure there's no dirt in there when you go reinstall it. Like you see, it dropped a bunch of dirt in there through the crankcase vent. And with the intake tube out of the way, I can access that bolt there on the EGR tube. It's that one right there. And it wouldn't hurt to spray some penetrating oil on that one either. Yeah, this car sat in the grass before I went and got it. It was sitting for about a year or so. And I think it was winter when it broke down, and they just left the salt on it. So the bottom one's a tricky one. I got a smaller extension here. It's about a 2-inch extension with a rounded tip on it, so a bit of a knuckle on it, so you can get into angled areas. And you need that shorter extension because it hits the diaphragm for the turbo wastegate without it. If you only have the longer extension, then you can just remove that diaphragm, or that's vacuum diaphragm for the turbo wastegate. But if you do have a little stubby extension, then that works pretty good. And I'm not taking the bolts out, I'm just loosening them off far enough so I can get that block off plate in there. So there's the bottom one, bolt's still in place. Maybe I went a little bit too far. Oh, my socket is stuck in there. There we go. And for my top one, I'm using a super long extension. You just get right in there, and then I can tighten it and loosen it from this side of the bumper. Hopefully loosen it with one hand so I can still video it. Nope. So there we go. That's enough to get my block out plate in there. So that pipe moves pretty easily, but I got a pretty big bar. So I'm just prying on the cooling pipe for the EGR tube, and I'm prying against the EGR housing itself. And don't pry too hard. You just want to make enough space that you can slide your EGR block off plate in there. And it looks like there's a gasket in there, but the gasket stayed on the intake side. So my gasket is going to be on the intake side. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to goop up both sides. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to goop up both sides of this thing with silicone and then just put it in there. It should be fine. That EGR tube is cooled with coolant anyway, so by the time the exhaust gets to the end, it's not going to be that hot. I didn't use cheap silicone on that. I used the Permatex, the right stuff, and this stuff has worked really good for me in the past. It's good for oil pans and good for all kinds of things. It's not really high temperature, but I don't think that EGR tube is going to see a whole lot of heat. Maybe on the exhaust side, but not on the aluminum part of it. just in the center there. So I really doubt it would burn off any of the silicone. And by the time it's tightened up, this silicone will have squished out of there. So I'm not too worried about it burning off. But if you want to, use high temp silicone on there and you won't have an issue. I used a big flat screwdriver. I shoved it underneath that cooling line and underneath the wiring harness, and I ran it onto the injection pump body there, and that'll keep them out of the way, so you can access the back of that EGR tube and slide your block out plate in there. The mounting bolt for the EGR is getting in the way there, so I'm going to pull that bolt out because the plate doesn't want to make it past there. You got to slide it a little bit farther down, and I can't slide it down far enough, so I'm going to remove that bolt there. And you can also access it pretty easily from the top, just with the socket and a ratchet. There, the bolt is out, and I should be able to slide that block out plate in there without any issue. The bolts for the tube going to the EGR valve are a Torx E8, and the bolts for the EGR valve body are E12. So you need an E8, an E12, and a flat screwdriver to do this. There, and just like that, the EGR valve blockout plate is installed, slid right in. So nothing left to do now but to tighten it up. You want to double check, make sure it's slid down all the way. So I just go and tighten up those two bolts, and then the plate is installed. And then I'll throw that EGR valve body bolt back in, and yeah, it's installed. Okay, I got the bolts tightened up. A little bit of silicone squished out of there, that's good. I don't have the torque specs for the bolts, I just did it by feel. If you go online, you might be able to find the torque specs for that. They don't have to be torqued down a terrible lot, just be careful with it. You just snug them up fairly well, you'll start feeling them creak, and that's when you should stop. Don't want to strip those out. Then you'll be screwed. You'll have to retap it and put in a different bolt. Okay, so the block off plate is installed. One thing you can do to make sure your EGR valve is going to function well, even though there's no exhaust gas coming into your intake anymore, the valve is still going to function. This solenoid here is still going to push on that little valve. So one thing you can do is remove that solenoid and put a couple drops of oil on the top of that valve. Give it a couple presses with your finger just to make sure it's moving nice and freely. And then just put your solenoid back on, and you should never have a problem with it throwing a fault code. And to remove that EGR solenoid, you need a Torx T25. You'll need to use two double knuckle extensions like I'm using there. So those have the pivot on the end of the extensions, or you could use a knuckle extension to get in there. Careful with this one, because if you're not getting it at the right angle, you'll just strip out the threads and then you'll be screwed. Then I don't know how you get that bolt off. Maybe with a pair of vice grips, and I don't know. And once you get it removed, there's your solenoid. That just depresses on the valve. And then there's the top of the valve. This one's caked up with a lot of soot, but the valve is still moving freely. So what you want to do is get all the soot out of there that you can. Depress your valve down all the way, squirt some oil in there, run it up and down a bunch of times with your finger, and then put your solenoid back on. And that'll help guarantee that that valve doesn't get stuck. So I'll scrape the soot out of there the best I can. It's not sticking, but it's probably pretty close to being stuck. Yeah, and if you just run that valve in and out a few times, you'll start seeing the carbon work its way out. Or the soot work its way out. And then just blow it out. Okay, I think I sufficiently worked out the carbon there. I'm just gonna put a couple drops of oil in there. ATF probably works pretty good, but any kind of oil will work. And lucky me, I got some used oil right here. Where's that penetrating oil? Well, the penetrating oil did the trick. Yeah, that's a lot more free than it was. It just pops right back on its own. And just drop a little bit more oil in there. And this is a lightweight oil, and it wasn't that dirty when I changed it. So this is lightweight oil, so it won't stick in the wintertime either. So something like 5W30 probably pretty good. Not gonna gum up the valve in the wintertime. But once it gets warm, it's not gonna stick anyway. Okay, so that's plenty free. I'm gonna reinstall my solenoid, which is pretty easy, 3 screws. I wouldn't put any oil on this one. It's a little bit different. When I depress it with my finger, that's how it sits on the valve, and then when power is put to it, it pushes that little cylinder out and actuates the EGR valve. So I wouldn't get any oil in there. It might get gummed up inside, but if you got a whole lot of carbon on the end here, maybe just give it a little bit of a spray, just like that. And that'll help ensure that solenoid isn't going to get seized up either. And then just reinstall it, and you're good to go. And an easy way to reinstall that solenoid is just to hold it with one hand from the top and reach underneath with your other hand and put that bolt in, if your arms are long enough. Just like that. That's probably the easiest way. And then the top ones are pretty self-explanatory, and just be careful tightening them down. They don't have to be that tight. They're not holding a whole heck of a lot. Yeah, don't strip them out, just be careful. Okay, so there's the EGR solenoid installed. There's the blockout plate installed. So it's good to go. So say you got an engine light on and your EGR valve is stuck. What you could do if you didn't want to remove the valve completely, you could probably take that solenoid off and get a screwdriver and a pair of vise grips and a can of penetrating oil, and just try to work that valve free and clean all that carbon out of there from the top. Just keep spraying the crap out of it and moving that valve up and down until you get it moving freely. And then if you don't have a scan tool to clear the code, I think it's after about 5 startups or so, the Smart will clear the code itself if there's no faults. So you could do it that way too. Just spray the crap out of it with penetrating oil, get some paper towel, wipe the carbon out of there, and just keep freeing it up until it moves nice and easily. It's all installed. I'm going to start it up and just make sure everything is working as it should. I'm going to block off the crankcase vent on this one here. That's another thing. The crankcase vent going into the intake, and then you get a bunch of oil in the intercooler, and it sits in the low spots. So I'm going to block that off, and I'm going to put the crankcase vent to the tailpipe. Yeah, seems to be running good. No engine light. EGR block off plate installed.